Our next example of a force from loads is called torsion, or torque. For instance, every time we turn one end of a rod and the other end isn't free to turn immediately, we twist it, and that's torsion. Let's look at this in more detail. I happen to have a cylinder of material that twists quite easily, and I've drawn a grid on it so that we can see what happens when I twist it. Now, the lines along the cylinder are straight, and the ones at right angles round it are circles. That's formed sort of curved squares, because they're not on a flat surface, they're on the curved surface of the cylinder. Now, I've clamped one end of it, so let's twist it and see what happens. There. Nothing much has happened to the circles, but the long lines are no longer straight. They're curving spirally around the cylinder. That means, of course, that the squares have become parallelograms. Now, that means we have tension in this direction and compression in that direction, just as we had with shear. And like shear, torsion could cause a cylinder to break along either the spiral path of compression or the spiral path of tension. Here's a good example. Here's a piece of chalk, and if I twist and break it, it does so along a spiral path. With a wet swimsuit, we have a simple example of using torsion to our advantage. When we twist it, the water squirts out. It's the compression caused by the twisting that pushes out the water. Now, this principle has had a revolutionary effect on the world of fashion, the clothes we wear. The revolution occurred in Paris in the 1920s. The leader was a designer named Mademoiselle Vionnet. But our story starts way back with the Victorian corset.
This is a Victorian corset right here. This one has aluminum rods in it. Back then, however, they would have used wood or whalebone, which are actually much more rigid and form your bones inside so that you'll get that shape.
Now, in Victorian times, the whalebone corset pulled women into tiny, slim-waisted shapes by applying extraordinary forces on their bodies, as we see in this demonstration at the Ontario Science Centre. The clothes were fitted to an almost rigid frame, and they always looked perfect. But the poor person wearing them had to suffer considerable discomfort, even to the point of affecting their physical health.
Now, you have to keep one thing in mind. This is a very, very large corset. It's much larger than anything they would have worn back in the Victorian period. It's made to fit people who work here at the Science Centre. Back then, they wanted very, very tiny waists, much smaller than we have today. And in fact, to be considered fashionable, the average woman was expected to have a waist size of about 43 centimeters or 17 inches. If you want to know how large that is, just put your hands around your neck, and that'll give you a basic idea right there.
Fortunately, women were liberated from the corset in the early part of this century, after the end of the First World War. The result was a lot of freedom in fashion, but also a lot of seemingly shapeless, ill-fitting clothes for women. They just sort of hung there. And that was really due to the way the fabric was woven and cut. The warp and weft of the weaving, the cloth of a dress or a blouse or any garment, was subject to tension, just because of its own weight. I know that seems unlikely, so let's see for ourselves. Now, in the cloth, the weft goes in that direction and the warp goes in this direction. Or is it the other way around? Well, it doesn't matter really, because what happens is that in tension, gravity, or you pulling down on the cloth, makes the long fibres get longer, and the ones in between, well, if anything, they sort of pinch together and get saggy. And that's what used to happen to clothes, and it still does. That's why you get baggy dresses, baggy knees, baggy everything else. Well, in 1922, Mademoiselle Vionnet invented what she called the bias cut. She figured that there was a way to get a clinging fit other than pulling strings on corsets and things. She found that if she put the cloth with the waft going in this direction and the warp going in that direction and pulled down, then both sets of fibres got longer and clung. the easiest thing is for me to demonstrate on my assistant here. Now, if I draw a grid on the bias, like that, and then pull down on the cloth, then there's a tendency for this grid to distort into a diamond or parallelogram shape that we've seen before. Oh, it's true that there is compression across there, but if the cloth is cut on the bias, there aren't any stringy bits of cloth in between to sag. So, although there's lateral compression and longitudinal tension, the result is that the fibres at an angle work together to give a much more satisfactory clinging sweater sort of look. Thank you. Of course, had we stopped to look at the world around us a little more closely, we would have seen the same principles at work in one of the world's true survivors, the shark. It's not built like other fish. It doesn't have a hard, bony skeleton. Some people regard it as more primitive than that. Well, the problem is that without a skeleton or a corset to hold its shape, the shark would be in great danger of kinking when it swims. It twists and bends as it swims, but oddly enough, it doesn't kink. That, of course, is dead lucky for the shark and its digestion. So why doesn't it get dents and kinks as it moves about? We can find the answer in its unusual skin. It is, in fact, structured like a bias-cut sweater. But how does this work to prevent kinking when in a sweater it works to make it cling better? What's the relationship? Well, let's have a look at two different kinds of tube for the answer. This one has the grid on it that we've used before, whereas this one has a double spiral pattern. Now, when we bend this, the inside of the curve is compressed, and that means that the lines along the tube try to get shorter. They can't, of course, so they kink up, just like the material does in a baggy dress or sweater. But look what happens with the other. This time, the compression on the inside of the curve forces the intersections of the lines closer together, but there's space between the material for it to squeeze into. So such a tube can be turned around quite tight curves without kinking. Of course, there is a limit. Eventually, those on the inside would pile up on each other, and on the outside, they would be stretched too far, but nowhere near as quickly as they would with this one. In our own world, we have also learnt to use what the shark has had for millions of years. This is a common garden hose. It too has helical bands to hold it both together and apart. This hose, just like the shark, has a great resistance to kinking as we bend it around the obstacles in our gardens. That means it never constricts the flow of water inside. Any hose that is not built that way, in fact, will kink. And you can stop the flow of water, which is quite a nuisance for us. Of course, it would be a blooming disaster for the shark. The cat's pyjamas in this warp and weft business is the solid fuel rocket, such as the boosters used for the shuttle.
1, 0, liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery as the first flight to retrieve and return satellites from space.
Now, designing the outside casing for such a rocket is not easy. It has to withstand considerable forces as the fuel burns. The solid fuel rocket has, of course, a cylinder of solid fuel inside, and actually there's a hole drilled up the middle to help it burn to the top. It's ignited in the centre, but the fuel burns so fast that it cracks almost immediately because of the thermal shock on the fuel, just like putting boiling hot water inside a cold drinking glass. The rocket fuel burns along the cracks, nipping almost immediately to the outside casing. Well, the rocket casing is made of metal and gets hot very quickly. It wants to expand, and the only way it can do so is to make its diameter larger. But that, unfortunately, makes it too big for the plug of fuel. The result, the fuel falls out of the bottom of the rocket, to the immense embarrassment of everyone concerned. So the problem the designers faced was how to stop the sudden expansion of the diameter of the rocket casing, and the only way to do that was to bind it helically around the outside with something that would not be subjected to conduction and expansion, or at least not as rapidly. It had to hold long enough for the fuel to burn further up the rocket, and it worked. Winding the warp and weft tightly at just the right angle meant that the only way for the casing to expand was along its length. Today,
Many big solid fuel rockets use this method in their construction. It's just another example of Mademoiselle Vionet's bias cut. Well, she died at the beautiful age of 98, blissfully unaware of her contribution to space travel. And of course, all explainable in terms of compression and tension and the control of torsion or twist. So now we come to bending. At first sight, it's not so much a force as it is a